you?
I'm not even gonna be funny, but so for you guys that don't know, we had a phone conversation last night, just prepping some of the topics or whatever, and I felt that, and I wanted to just say like I think I know I'm sure because I was also there. You've drawn bigger audiences to the things that you've done than what you're having right now. This is, and I'm not like um diminishing myself when I say this because I just understand how the world works. Um, this would be not low hanging fruit for you, but like you're way more free and way more entertaining and way more uh exciting to see here than you think. Like you shouldn't be the nervous one. I should be the nervous one.
Aw, shucks. This is like, all right. Well, listen, I appreciate your words. No, it's not about the size of the audience. In my career, you're absolutely right. I have played, spoken, performed for, in some cases, thousands of people, just because that's kind of the trajectory that my career took me on. But I don't think that I ever get nervous because of the size of the crowd. I think sometimes one person can be super intimidating, and so it's not even about the size of the crowd. It's just who's listening, how carefully they're listening. I don't know, Marquise, would you agree that if you have two people who are really intently listening, that can sometimes be more nerve wracking than 1,000 people who are maybe not quite tuned in?
Okay, I'm gonna take that as a jump off point. So, I'm actually a friend of mine who has been to a lot of my performances. Knows that that's kind of my motto. Whether it's 2 people or 2,000 people, I'm still going to be belting and screaming out like my poetry the way that I do. It's now
Okay.
I always say I perform for the soul of the one, and everybody that connects is just a benefit to that. So I
Hmm.
definitely understand that. Trust me.
Okay, I like that. I like that. I like that we're having some common ground here.
Oh, of
So,
course.
how's your day going?
I'm gonna be honest with you. It started. I never take midday naps. That was new for me. I woke up really early. I finally, because we rarely do this, I had a walk with my dad. We met another parent who, while we were trying to be funny with each other, the other parent was like, "Oh, my son and me, we do the same thing." And then he was like, "My son's 27," and then I was like, "I'm 27." He's like, "Well, I'm 67." He's my dad's 67. It was just like the coincidence of the fact that I had asked him to go outside in the morning because I wasn't planning to go with him. We were just picking up little things, and I was like, "I'll go," and he's like, "No, you go." So we had just let's go together. It's amazing how things like can connect for the day. So I had a great start to my day.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then for some reason I was just tired, and I was like, "Well, we have this at 3, so why not why not just take a little if you need to take a little nap." And then I woke up, it was 2 o'clock, and had seen your messages. I was like, oh man, here we go.
Yeah, I wasn't harassing you with messages.
No, no, no,
Yeah,
I
I
just
was
was
just
like,
like,
I wish
no, I
I
was
had the
just like, can I get the
details.
link? Can I get the link? That's all I wanted. I was like, wait a second, does he think I'm going to magically just find myself on Twitch? So
And
there we
welcome to
go.
Twitch, by the way. This would be your Twitch
Thank you.
debut.
This is my. How did you know that?
I could feel it. I could feel it. It's just the way it is. Like I know.
Okay, you've got a Twitch sixth sense. I got it. I got it. So, does your audience know why I'm even here?
Why
Does
don't
anyone
you tell
know
them? I
why
mean,
you
they do.
why?
It's part of the go live notification that I send.
So
It's
what
like a
did you
newsletter that all my followers get every time I go live, so they
So what
know.
did
But
you
why don't you
say
tell us?
about this? So wait. What did you say about me? I want to make sure that I'm not contradicting whatever lies you've been spreading.
Ooh, I like this. I like this. Okay, you see, you do. I like I said last night. You really do have a genuine like. I could feel like that. You need to be on TV. You do need to be on TV. Yeah,
Well,
I would say.
that is a nice segue to the fact that I actually make documentary films. But you said something to me last night when we spoke on the phone, which I have never heard ever from anyone about anyone. And I think that you should be telling your audiences about this because you told me that, how did you phrase it? That my voice is like a major chord. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Kind of like that. That was, I got to tell you, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I take that as a high compliment.
Yeah, I mean, I meant it as a high compliment.
Yeah.
There's, I mean, it's also so comparing you, having you here as opposed to like the people that I've had on the show before. There's a lot of dishonesty and there's a lot of like very muddy waters that I end up getting into with these people. And sometimes, or I would like to say, since I've been doing this more than what I was doing when I was a little younger, I've met more people that have that dishonest, like, I don't even want to say brainwash trait, but more like a flow of wanting to be the centerfold in the conversation, even if what they're saying doesn't have merit to it. And
Hmm.
when I talk to you, you kind of you feel like a really good friend of mine. There's nothing I see where, like, which we had mentioned before, there's nothing in which I see there's a point you're trying to get across that makes you feel or like you're the better person in the topic of conversation. There's nothing that you say, or there's no tone to how you speak that brings out a like a, well, really, why would you say something like that, or you're really gonna have to roll me back here a second. I don't understand how
I
you're saying 1 2 and then getting the 3 because you should be at like 9 by now. Those type of things. And when I associate all of that together, I think of it as like kind of a pure sense of I know what I'm getting when I hear it, and that's what made me think about the major chord. I know what I hear when I'm getting it. I'm odds on not going to confuse that with like an augmented or a diminished chord, if that makes sense. There's a I can, if you give me the chord, okay, that's major. I can figure out the scale, like I could work with it. You give me like a an inverted augmented sus4. Why do I just what notes are you playing? I don't understand that
you're
type of thing.
you're just calling me diatonic. That's all I am. I'm diatonic. None of that chromatic muddying of the waters. Um, Thank you, Marquise. That's so kind. What you just said. I don't know if it's honestly all true. I mean, I think you believe it's true. I'm not saying that it necessarily is true about me, but that's really really generous on your part. High praise, like I said. But let's get back to the topic at hand, which is what did you tell your audience so that I don't, inadvertently contradict you.
I told him that I believe that you're one of the greatest composers of the modern era.
Well, that's
Um,
already a lie because I barely compose. So let's start with that. I used to compose, but maybe you mean like just a musician because
as a musician, yeah,
as you
like
guys can see by this thing behind me, I'm a pianist. Well, actually, the prop doesn't necessarily make me a pianist, right? But there's I really am a pianist.
it's
Uh,
so funny because wait, you can't see it. Let me see if I move over.
I
I
can see my
also,
keyboard. Hmm.
yeah,
There you go, Marquise, the greatest pianist of the 19th century. Um,
trying my hardest, trying my hardest.
So, well, listen, I don't, this whole thing about greatness or, comparative qualities. I mean, who knows? I wouldn't categorize myself that way. I shouldn't categorize myself that way. But I think that what I do is I've been spending a lifetime in my professional career trying to figure out what it is I want to do. And I'm still figuring it out. But one thing that I started to do, well, okay, let me take several steps back before I even launch into it. I think one of the most important things for me that I've discovered is that I like to teach. I love to teach. I like to communicate. I think that's just fundamentally important for me. People who know me know that I can talk a lot. That's not an issue. I can talk for hours and hours and hours. I can communicate. I can share. That is not something that I have trouble with. So what happened is I've been playing the piano since I was 5, so it's been a couple years. And I had some successes in my career as a pianist. I was very fortunate. I started performing professionally in my teens, performing with orchestras, traveling around throughout the United States, a couple of trips to Europe. I started making commercial recordings in my early 20s. And just what I was trying to do was come up with projects that would be unique, that would be meaningful, because there's so much noise in the world. I mean, you know this. I mean, you're trying to get your voice out, and something that I've always said to you is that the reason that I listen to you is because I think you have a charm that communicates right away, and that actually, and I do mean this in a positive way, it transcends sometimes the specifics of what you're talking about. Like, you are charming,
Thank
right?
you.
You're compelling to watch, you're compelling to listen to. And even if I or some other person listening happens to disagree, that doesn't matter so much because we're still willing to engage with you because of that charm. So, anyway, going back to what I was saying, Something I tried to do initially is just find projects that would be interesting. So one of my earliest projects was recording the complete works of this one composer who unfortunately has since died, not because of my project. This guy named Lucas Foss, Foss, who was this German-born composer who was pretty prominent in American music, kind of in the same cohort as Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, like kind of that school of American music. And so I was the first person, if you can imagine, to record all of his solo piano pieces on one album. And like when I was doing it, he was about to turn 80. I was 24. And I was just shocked that no one had done it. And I did it. And it kind of, it gave me this window of kind of where I realized that if I can find projects that are interesting and unique, I can get them done. Right? It's not, it doesn't mean it's easy, but I can get them done. So fast forward to 2010, and I had been playing this sonata, this piano sonata by this one composer who sadly has also since died. Again, I can put in the morbid joke again, not because of my project. This guy named Donald Harris. And this sweet man, really fine musician, unfortunately lesser known in the larger pantheon of American music. And I'd been playing this terrific sonata of his that he composed when he was about 24, 25 years old. And I had this thought in my head that I'd been playing the piece for 10 years at that point. So from 2000 to 2010. So I've been dealing with this music, working through this music, even writing papers about this music because I was in grad school. I did my graduate work was in music theory and music composition, even though I have since not really composed anything. But anyway, so I've been kind of living and breathing this music for a while, and it isn't the easiest music for a general audience to perceive because it's in that serial atonal style. It's one of the questions you had actually asked me ahead of this conversation. You know, can I define atonal music? So I can do that in a general way. You know, it depends on what your audience is interested in, right? We can define it technically, but from a general perspective, it's music that is as concerned with consonance as it is concerned with dissonance, meaning concordant or discordant sound combinations, and it places equal value on both types of sounds. So tonal music, for example, again, I'm being general. Tonal music places a lot of emphasis on sounds that are, well, they work well together, right? They're concordant, they're consonant. And dissonance, the other side of it, is meant to be something that resolves into consonance. So it's kind of like, I don't know, how about a visual analogy, like a body of water that's really clear and then the same body of water that's really muddied. So tonal music wants the mud to eventually disperse and come back to that sense of a clean, kind of pristine water. Whereas atonal music finds value in the muddy water as much as in the, you know, the clean stream. I know this is such a weird, as I'm
No,
saying.
I think that's a great way to lay that down. I don't know if I don't have specifics on like every single viewer that I have and what they know, but if
Why
you
not?
because that's hard. I
I'm
I
just
used to ask that question with a couple of my other streamer friends. Like, if your audience gets bigger, are you always gonna remember like those like few people that are like constants in your chat? No, I would just say for those that like wanted a 2014
well,
effort, it's like if the song "Happy" was in minor and like was never in major, like
well,
that thing, like.
major sound, right? Minor sound, diminished, augmented, right? Going back to what you said earlier, this supposedly is me, right? That's not good. And atonality places as much value in this, and this is so crude. So for those who know what I'm talking about, please forgive the reductive nature of this. But this atonality says this is just as awesome as this. I mean, that's how I would say it, just as a starting point, right? But the point about that film that I'm talking about, this this first documentary film that I made about Donald Harris, is I had been playing that sonata, which is atonal, and to me it was beautiful. Partly because I wasn't the listener in the audience, just kind of passively experiencing it. I was also kinesthetically involved with it because I was playing it and learning about it and thinking about it constantly. So, of course, my involvement was different from what your, average listener in the audience would experience. But the thought came to me, I wish I could create a platform for this specific sonata so I could, again, communicate about it, educate about it, so that it would humanize the music, because it wouldn't just be this abstract piece of music that sounds very discordant, but rather there's a person behind it, right? Let's get to know the composer, this guy, Donald Harris. So, I woke up one day, I remember it must have been, well, I said 2010, but it must have been 2009. And I was like, I want to make a film about this. And YouTube at that time was really beginning its ascendancy. And you kind of felt at the time that this would be a very powerful platform for so many things, including, of course, education. So I had this thought that maybe I would just make a video for YouTube. But it evolved beyond that. And I ended up assembling a team. I always want to say like a crack team of specialists, but no, it's just of people who were experts at what they did, sound engineers, camera operators, editors, and everyone kind of shared my vision that let's take this incredible piece of music, at least as far as I thought, and present it in a way with the composer that people can, even if they don't like it, they get to accept it. There's a phrase that's often said that you don't have to like everything about a person, but you do have to find something appealing, right? It's kind of echoing what I said about you earlier, right? That there's a charm that you possess that even if I disagree with some of the things you say, I'm not saying I do. I'm just
Right.
saying,
No. Yeah. Yeah.
right? Well, that thing you said, no, but even if I disagree with some things, it doesn't matter because I like you and I'm willing to engage with you because of that. So I think that that was my point with that piece of music, with that sonata. So I made the film. It was a very quick project. It took only a year. And man, was I spoiled with that timeline. I was like, you know what? Filmmaking is, documentary filmmaking, super easy. And remember, I was a complete novice. I had never made this before. I was just surrounded by people who were so good and so professional and so committed. And again, I was spoiled by it. So I was like, all right, what's next? Let's make another documentary. It'll take like 3 months. So I started my next project,
Hmm.
and this one was about another composer whose music I'd played and who I knew personally. And this guy's name, he's still very much alive. His name is David Del Tretici, and you can put some links in, right?
Yeah. I was just about to say this would probably be the time for those.
Good time for a link. Oh, and by the way, that first film, the one about Donald Harris's Sonata, I just put it up on my YouTube channel. I just was like, you know what, this has to be shared. I'm not going to worry about streaming or anything like that, or just keeping it kind of private. So the name of that film is Sonata, and then in parentheses 1957, because that's the name of the piece, Sonata 1957. And what was cool about that film is I had Donald Harris as a 79-year-old man looking back at his 25-year-old self. And the questions are so interesting. Marquise, I'm going to get you when you're 79, and I'll ask you. By then, I'll be what, like 100 and some? So, no, wait a second. I'm not that much older. I'm 15 years older than you, right? So, I'll be in my 90s, 94, and I'll say, well, what was it like when you were 25? And you'll tell me that story about walking with your dad.
I'm
When
gonna
you,
have to. Then I'm gonna have to make sure that that's one of the things that I land down in my memory, which I think I can do.
so, so there's so many interesting points about when you're much, much older, looking back decades at one of your first professional compositions and just seeing if it's really the same person. Are you when you're at the beginning of your career compared to when you're, well, in this case, toward the end of the career? But that film is up on my YouTube channel. So if you want to put that link in, I would appreciate that too.
I exactly
Opus
that link
One,
I just put in.
thank you. Opus One Films. All right, so let me. I apologize to your viewers here because I kind of have been crisscrossing right across.
Okay, so don't even get mad because everybody knows that's all I do. I've gone from like my I've gone from like the fact that I lost my wallet a few days ago to like how systemic racism makes us all feel like there's nothing we can do. I've jumped the
I mean, these are connected topics if you think about it, right? Losing something of value. I mean, I'm not even being facetious. I'm not even trying to joke around about that. Um, I've been thinking about these topics as well. I think any person in our society has to be aware of such issues. You can't just skirt by anymore, pretending that these things aren't there. But at the risk of suddenly getting serious, let me get. Let me get back. So David Del Tredici, this composer who was born in 1937, he's now 84. He just turned 84 in March, and I had a very kind of funny conversation with him because, like I mentioned, I know him personally. I've known him for, well, since 2002 at this point, so almost 20 years. And so I call him, of course, every so often. I called him on his birthday. I was like, David, happy birthday. How are you? He's like, just getting over coronavirus. I was like, wait a second, but you're in a kind of dangerous age category for that. How did this happen? He goes, well, I got my first vaccine and then I got sick with corona. I was like, David, I mean, I don't mean to be, I'm not laughing about the virus, but I was just like, David, what are you doing? Are you, what's going on? You know, he's like,
Right.
I felt like things would be okay. But anyway, he recovered, he got a second shot. So to me, that's one of the unusual stories, but it's very defining to me about David's personality because this composer, he is at the beginning of my documentary film about him, which is called Secret Music. I have this voiceover, and I say in the very first sentence that for David Del Tredici, boundaries are at the very least porous, right? And I remember writing that copy, that script, and just thinking, I want to communicate that this is a man without boundaries. Like he is such an interesting person to know. And I'll give you some examples, right, along the way if you want to hear them.
Sure, go.
He's a person who just doesn't conform, and that is so refreshing. It is to me personally, because I'm a person who would like to think of myself as a nonconformist, but I don't think that that's really what I am. You know, I think that as much as I'd like to be the rebel without a cause, you know, because we grow up on maybe my generation, because as I've hinted at, I'm not the same generation as you, of course. Um, my generation kind of grew up with certain models that were very attractive, like the James Dean models, or this, I mean, that's before my time,
Hmm.
but even the Beat generation, all before my time. But I was growing up and I was hearing about this prior generation of artists and bohemians and people who were just free and they were constantly at odds with convention. They were subversive. And it's such an attractive, again, to me, it's such an attractive stance. But I realize, and I think this is the truth of the matter, to be a truly subversive individual, it's not easy. It's not romantic. It's romanticized. But when you're in that position, you are living one of the most difficult existences imaginable, and there's nothing pretty about it. There's nothing easy about it. So when you meet a truly subversive person, not someone who wants to be subversive, who claims to be subversive because of maybe, you know, like I jaywalked today.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna
That's,
say, yeah, exactly.
no, so of course that's like a light example, but you know what I mean. I mean, there's one thing to aspire towards subversion, but not really commit to everything that comes with it. And then there are people who really are subversive. And Del Tredici, this composer, he really is. And the thing is, to be subversive is a sacrifice because every stage that you walk through your life as a subversive individual, you burn bridges whether you want to or no, right? You alienate people, you offend people, you ruin friendships and relationships, even if you didn't really want that. I mean, some people do. But in the case of David, what I've noticed is that when he talks about his life, and remember, he's 84 now. So when he reflects back on the many decades of his existence, there's so many times where he talks about being alone. There's so many times where he talks about how he just didn't feel good about something, like he didn't feel right teaching somewhere because he's a composer, right? He's a musician. So he's had some really prestigious positions, like teaching at Harvard, for example, right? And just suddenly this feeling, like he says, he's like, I didn't feel right, so I left. And to me, I'm an academic as well. I teach in the university system. And to me, my jaw just dropped. I'm like, you left Harvard? What do you mean you left Harvard? Like you got a severance package and you left Harvard? He's like, no, I just didn't feel right that it was interfering with my creative process. And maybe that's not like the most subversive example. I have more, but that is just such a striking and
No,
in
for
a
sure.
way, maybe it's a courageous thing to do in a
Yeah,
way.
there's
Oh,
me included, sadly in that. diagram of it's almost like you want it to be a committed betrayal to things that normally, or I shouldn't even say normally, that are um quote unquote keys to the system. Like, okay, you taught at Harvard, you went to Harvard, like that's doors. Doors are open for you. Societal expectation is open, like the bar is you're up there, I don't have to worry about you. If you need help and this and that, we've got plenty of resources. We will dedicate portions of our time to make sure you are okay by you having those credentials. So to walk away from that, almost if we want to bring it back to a level of where we've been, it's like Dave Chappelle leaving Hollywood, um,
That's a good example.
and going to live in Africa. It's okay. Wow, he turned down all that money and all that fame and all that would have his name would have been a household name. All what could force a person to want to look inside themselves and say, "Yeah, the easy life that I earned, I didn't. It wasn't handed to me. I worked for it. I cannot bear that badge on me right now. That's
Right.
not how my soul feels. And if I do it, I'm gonna be sitting there with too much regret, too much ex. No, I have to go do something else. So I definitely understand that.
And it's as you're saying this, it dawns on me. It's such an interesting example to, when you bring up Dave Chappelle. I think that's a great example because everyone was kind of shocked by that, right? But look, in all fairness, though, he's back in the spotlight, correct? And in a way, his leaving for a period of time, who am I to say this? But I don't think that it really negatively impacted his career now in hindsight, right? Because when you think back, he is a household name, absolutely, and he's a terrific. I don't even want to call him a comic anymore because if you listen to his most recent shows, I mean, he has, I think, such an astute ability to comment and observe about society that at the same time is brutally honest, but also, again, he's got that charm that when you listen to some of the things he says that in someone else's mouth might come across as just kind of insulting and offensive, they don't come across that way with him. And again, he just has that masterful way where you feel like he's speaking truth. And I wish I knew how to capture that essence because that is something that a lot of people don't possess, right? They may feel like they're saying something that's really important, and maybe what they are saying is important, but there's something about their demeanor that gets in the way of that message, right? It's the platform for the messaging. And in this case with Dave Chappelle, he figured it out, whether it's instinctive, natural, or whether he's been honing it over his career, but he knows how to do it. I don't know how you feel about what I'm saying.
No, that's correct. We've covered a few of his specials on here, so yeah, we've gone in that same direction.
And I have to add, though, at the risk of making this a little bit too simplistic, but part of this like subversive stance, you kind of have to ask where are you coming from in the first place as you embark on this subversion, right? So are you rebelling when you're already in a place of relative privilege? Like you're really wealthy and you're really famous and you have an amazing job that people would kill for, and then you kind of walk away from it. That's a very privileged position to be in as you embark on your rebellion. Or are you coming in from the margins of society? Are you someone that society rejects, marginalizes, puts on the periphery, or even worse, just completely ignores? Like you don't exist as far as society is concerned. Society doesn't see you. In which case, can you really be a rebel? Can you be a subversive person? Because you have to react to be a subversive person. I would imagine you have to be reacting against something that you might actually be a part of. Kind of like, was I talking about this yesterday? Because like the Matrix movies, right? I'm sorry. I know right away people are like, don't go into this. I'm not going to go into it, but really quickly. The only reason the Matrix makes sense is because these characters start off by being plugged into it. So they can rebel against a system that they used to be a part of. Otherwise, the films wouldn't be interesting if you had somebody who was never connected, like, hey, I see that thing over there. I'm going to fight against it. Well, you don't know anything about that thing. So what exactly is your beef about? What are you fighting against? So
We call that in the filmmaking world, we call that manufactured tension. Actually,
there you, there you go. So this actually, for your viewers who are like, what the hell are they talking about right now? This actually connects right back to that composer, David Del Tredici, because his subversion had to do with recognizing what was going on in the music system that he was a part of and reacting to it. And again, in some cases, this takes a lot of guts. He just went with his instinct, which is not always correct. And it doesn't always prove the wise decision, right? We have to always temper our instinct against our analytical capabilities, right? You have to really think about what you're going to do, and some people don't. Some people are just, well, whatever happens, I'll just do it, and I'll pick up the pieces later on. And I think that David is, pardon my armchair psychology, but I think that he's a little bit like that as a person. Like, he just says whatever he wants to say, he does whatever he wants to do, and then you worry about the consequences, right? Kind of like, what's that saying? Act first, apologize later. So he's kind of like one of these people. So let me bring it back to his biography, because I think this is, again, super interesting. So he was coming up as a composer so he went to school in the 1950s. He was coming up as a major composer in the 1960s and 70s. And at that time in American music, in the university, in the academy, right? We talked about the differences between atonal and tonal music earlier. So atonal music was kind of the currency, the aesthetic currency of music in the American Academy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I'm being reductive, right? Because for everything I say, there are a ton of counterexamples, and I'm not going to deny that. But in this case, just to keep it simple, the style was this kind of acerbic, difficult, complicated, intellectual style. Where there would be formulae and algorithms that would have to be assembled on the compositional side. And then when those permutations and combinations are played, again, the general audience, the uninitiated, I want to be really specific with my language, the uninitiated will go, well, what the hell was that? That just sounded like chaos and just constant dissonance. But that was the prevailing mode of, let's say, 1960s academic American music. So David is working within that system, and some of his early pieces, which, by the way, are just glorious, I have to say. I've played some of them. I've listened to a lot of them if they're not for piano. But for example, his fantasy pieces for piano are early pieces. He was 22 years old, just coming out of Princeton, right? He was going to grad school there. Again, nice place to be, right? Syzygy is another piece for orchestra. He has a bunch of settings of James Joyce poetry with piano and voice. And these are, again, atonal pieces. They're difficult pieces, but he had this natural instinct, the way his ear was developing, which was constantly pulling him away from that, again, difficult style towards something that was really just pleasing, right? Emotionally, directly accessible. And that's what we might call tonal music. There's a reason that popular music is popular. It's because it appeals directly to the emotions, right? People look for hooks because it makes us feel good. It reminds me of, actually, Marquise, you might remember this, but do you remember in one of my classes, because your audience knows that you were in one of my classes, right?
Yes, that's part, yes.
I was like, should I tread in this? So I remember reading this, but we read an article about Will.i.am.
Yes, wow. Yes.
Do you remember
the subject matter is of course lost to me, but like I do remember you making a big thing out of that.
Will.i.am wrote something so interesting, right? Or said something in an interview. And again, this is at least 10 years old. But he basically said, you know how there are hooks in every popular song? My aim was to make the entire song the hook. And if you think about some of his songs or the Black Eyed Peas, it is just one big hook. And I take that as just, there's a kind of a revelation when you hear that. You're like, wait a second, you can do that? You can make the whole thing popular. You can make the whole thing immediately appealing to the audience. And so I'm not likening David Del Tredici to Will.i.am. These are completely different styles, completely different generations, completely different people. But what David was doing was he was kind of reacting to that difficult music that was so popular in the American Academy. And he was like, but why are we losing our audience? Why can't we write music that the audience wants to listen to? So he started to kind of drift back toward this, let's call it the romantic style of, in terms of like European European origins, right? European inspired classical music. The Romantic era is the 19th century. So some of the big names of that era, again, within this one specific genre of European music, because not to confuse it, but that's just one slice of all the possible musics in the world, of course,
Of course.
even though it tends to be very overrepresented in American music departments. For again, for better or for worse, I don't know if I necessarily think that that's consistently a bad thing, but it can be. I think the most important thing is just to realize that there are other musics, instead of pretending that there aren't. But
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No,
but I
you hit the
digress.
nail on the head with that one.
I mean, really, there's a, I'm so drawn to another digression, but like you said, you do this, I do this in my teaching all the time. And one thing that I always promise my students is, even if I do take a circular path, I will always come back to the thing I was talking about initially. So I don't know if you,
I'm sorry. Are you actually aware that was teaching for the period before and during the programs that I told you about?
I think I, no, I think I maybe knew that. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So that we started on that, and I almost wanted to jump on that right when you said it. Um, I am a teacher. I've been gracious enough
Awesome.
to get a couple of shots to do things at places like NYU, Bryn Mawr, Columbia University. Yeah, no,
Amazing. Good for you. Congratulations. That is so.
I love I when you started with how you felt about being a teacher, I was like, well, you should know you were one of the reasons why I got into the field in the first place. And I think I told you that when we had, well, guys, story time. We had met on the bus randomly, and I was looking at him. I'm like, that is not my professor. No way. And yeah, it was him. And yeah, you're definitely one of the inspirations I had, because while I think, and I'm not,
I have no
you don't
memory.
work there anymore. So I'm the
Wait, wait, where? Okay,
City College.
no, I teach a couple classes
Okay,
here.
so
That's great.
we'll keep names to names, but
That's
I've
good.
had a couple of I've had a couple of issues with some of the professors in the music
Yeah,
department.
but listen, but that's going to be true everywhere you go, right? Because you invite people. No, I'm just kidding. No, no, no. That's going to be true everywhere. It's a funny thing on this topic. Let's have a digression of a digression. But sometimes I get this criticism, not necessarily directed toward me, but just students will say, I really hated that teacher. And I'm like, is that really necessarily a problem? Because don't you learn from that experience as well? Like, you learn what you're willing to put up with and what you're not willing to put up with. You learn how you learn, basically. So when you have an excellent teacher, you have to think, why did that work? Was it the personality? Was it the curriculum? Was it the content? Was it the way that person dressed? I mean, who knows? There's so many factors in this. And the same questions about when you say, I had a terrible experience. So why? What was the issue?
Oh, do you
You know?
want me to answer that, or?
No, no, I mean, I'm asking.
You're right. The question, yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure, because I could go into it.
No, but I really do mean it, because I think back to my education, and the truth is, I don't remember. I remember my teachers, but I don't necessarily remember anything about the content. I might remember, like, oh, that was a cool guy, or I tell this story to my students. Here's our third digression from the main path, but I was very fortunate. My second semester senior year in college, I was an English major, and I took a course that you had to get into. You had to apply to get into this super exclusive senior seminar taught by Edward Said. If you guys don't know who Edward Said was, he died in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. He was a superstar scholar, super, like, internationally known. He pioneered a new field in literary studies known as Orientalism. He wrote a book by the same title. And he was also a pretty prominent musician, but he was teaching this course called Irish literature, which really amounted to the literature of the oppressed. It was an ideological political course disguised as a literature course. And that's not something I figured out until much later. So, I walked in thinking that was the shit, that I'm a super senior. I mean, not a fifth not
Yeah,
a
right.
fifth year senior, but like I'm a super senior at this college and I know things and I've taken anyway. All of that was bullshit because he was such an imposing intellectual presence that as soon as he opened his mouth and started teaching, I realized that whatever I thought I knew was out the window. I didn't know anything, and I was ready to just kind of lay down and say, well, I am a blank slate, teach me. But the difficulty of that class is that I started off, or maybe the funny story here is that I started at this seminar. It was a small group of students, maybe 9 or 10. We sat around a table. It was all very the way that movies present the college experience, right? We might as well just have been wearing tweed jackets. So I started off sitting right next to him, and I really quickly realized I should not be in his line of sight because if he asks me anything, I know this much nothing, nothing. So I'm just going to humiliate myself. So the next session, I sat one seat over. And the session after that, I sat another seat over. And as the semester progressed, I just moved further and further away until I left the conference table altogether and tried to just press myself into the wall as far away from him as possible. And I think eventually he stopped seeing me. And I was like, I was relieved because of that, because I knew that at least I wouldn't be called upon and I wouldn't have to embarrass myself. And I did embarrass myself at the end of the day because the paper I wrote for that class was subpar at best. Anyway, why am I even talking about this? Something about teaching. Yeah, I forget. Let's go
No,
back to our.
we can go back, but before you do that, I want to bridge, make another bridge between us, and I want to show you something. So I
Okay.
want to show everybody something. I feel out. Even though I feel like I've shown this before, it's very funny you mentioned that because this is a letter from a student of mine who sadly I was let go from where I was at like a week after she met me. And she said the same thing. I'm not gonna read everything, but I came here thinking I knew everything. Unfortunately, I didn't. But your patience, passion, and energy helped me through my frustrations. Being told something I created was good was the best feeling in the world, and this week made me feel happier than I've ever been in so long. And there's more, but and it's just funny you mentioned that because that's what soured me when it came to, or that's why I thought of you as such a good professor when you said like, well, think about the reasons why and everything. It not only was the subject matter because when I came in, I've written essays, I've top marks in SAT English. I never had a problem with any course in English studies ever. Um, you taught me about a new avenue of writing that isn't, the flowery prose and the explaining yourself through multiple paragraphs and really diving into the point. It has to be, you can't fluff your sentences up because what you're writing about has a strict code to it. There is a meaning directly there. There are artists that exist that will tell you, I specifically wrote this motive for that reason. And like I can understand you interpreting it a different way, but like you really have to stretch for it. And you shouldn't be stretching when it comes to writing about music, which was the course. Because
I
there is a, and I'm only saying this compared to how I used to write before I entered into that course because I would write about essays, Romeo and Juliet, like book studies. There's different types of writing, and I felt like, well, if I'm getting all these high marks and all these writing courses, I must know it all. And oh, there's a way to describe things that isn't with like 17 adjectives and a run-on sentence with
Just
three
16.
lines.
Just 16. That's all you need.
16.
I draw the line at 16 adjectives. But yeah, of course. I mean, that's just part of, forgive me for saying it this way, but it's just kind of growing up, right? As an intellectual person, you just realize that there are multiple ways of doing something, and some situations call for efficiency and like the economy of language, and other situations don't. And also, it depends on the culture and language within which you're operating. Because, if you happen to speak multiple languages, one of the coolest things about speaking other languages, languages other than English, is every culture has a kind of larger, let's call it, aura of efficiency or flowery prose, kind of the way you said it. So there are some languages that are just simply romantic, and I don't mean literally the romance languages, but I mean languages that have no problem culturally expressing something with many different adjectives. And other languages are very succinct and right to the point. And if you practice that culture as well as that language, speaking that language, then you come to see that culture and language are deeply intertwined. So it's not about this artificial construct of you must be efficient just because. It's how is this related? It's basically what you said. How is this related to the culture? But also, and culture is not one thing, of course, but how is this also related to the discipline? So in the case of music, and this is something that we talked about yesterday on the phone as well, and I want to come back to this through the lens of David Del Tredici and in my film, but music is highly abstract, right? It would be hard pressed to argue that it isn't, I think. So music is one of those disciplines, one of those arts where there is a tremendous amount of power in the abstraction. This isn't true in other fields, right? If you are, giving a presentation about the state of the stock market, and you start to use abstractions that, constantly shift away from the topic at hand, most of your audience will just simply disqualify you. You don't know what you're talking about. But in music, you get that power of there's a huge buffer zone around what music really is and what it communicates. But anyway, let me it's like Inception level digression at this point. Let's jump back to the
we need a
first
couple
dream,
kicks.
or the first reality. Because I think like your audience at this point is kind of like some of those scenes in Inception where they're slowly falling off the bridge and we're just waiting. Let's get back into it. So, okay, my film about David Del Tredici. I was talking about how he's this subversive person, that he doesn't, like I said in that opening VO, the voiceover in my film, that boundaries are at the very least porous. So he, in the 1960s and the 1970s, his ears started to gravitate away from this discordant atonal style. And he started to write purely tonal music, music that was similar to, and this is actually the first point of our digression, similar to the Romantic generation of 19th century European composers. So who would you compare Del Tredici to? Franz Schubert is a good example. Schubert's another character in music history who I'm fascinated by. He died very young. He was 31 years old when he died. He was probably gay. And the reason that that's so intriguing to me and why I'm making this comparison with David Del Tredici is because David Del Tredici is an openly gay musician. Well, he's just an openly gay person. Let's start with that. And in today's age, especially in progressive societies, like in New York City, for example, that's not a big deal. It's like it's almost not even worth mentioning. Like, who cares what someone's sexual identity is or sexual orientation is? But remember that David was born in the 1930s. So when he started to kind of realize his own sexual identity, his own identity more broadly as a human being, it was a time when there wasn't necessarily a label for what he was feeling. A label that wasn't also a pejorative, right? So at that time, what were some of the words that could have been used, to describe people who had, let's say, effeminate characteristics? Even that term right now is problematic because it's used as a kind of slur, right? If you say to a man, right? Let's take these sort of stereotypical, cliched notions. If you say to a man, right, you're like, you're kind of effeminate. That is not meant to be a positive thing, right? So
It's so funny. I feel like, what was it, chat? Was it yesterday where we were just covering the kind of king of that? His name is Steven Crowder. Wow, to
yeah,
really drive that down.
the convince me of guy, right?
Yeah. Oh
Um,
God. He
yeah.
knows. That's
Well,
it.
listen. So I'm not here to talk about those issues because this is what I said to you over the phone.
Yeah.
There are topics where if I start rambling, I just come across like an idiot, and I don't want to go into. I don't want
Yeah,
to
no,
veer.
it's fine. No, we don't have to. I just
Um,
we understand the
but what I'm trying to say is that David, realizing that there was something different about his identity, and any word to describe it would have been a negative, just right off the bat, right? So, effeminate or sissy, words like that. I mean, they're not words that we use now, right?
Of course.
In any meaningful way, fortunately, right? I'm glad that in some cases where we've made some progress. But he didn't have he didn't know how to identify himself. So, he tells the story of how when he was really young, like 12 years old, 11 years old, that instead of playing sports, which would have been like the boyish thing to do, he he discovered flower arranging, and he was entering into these flower arranging contests with a bunch of old ladies. This is how he tells it, right? So it's kind of quaint and it's kind of amusing when he says that. But really, to get to the point, as he's discovering his interest in tonal music as he's in his 20s, at the same time, he's discovering that there is an appropriate way of describing his own identity as a human being, as a sexual person. And this is where his truth in music and his truth in terms of his own identity begin to finally coalesce. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The two start coming together because he starts to feel comfortable composing music that truly appeals to him, that's honest for him. And not to say that anything he was doing before that was dishonest, but just more comfortable for him. And at the same time, he's beginning to really understand who he is as an individual. So when the two come together, that's when he becomes, an all-powerful kind of. It's almost like a superhero story, right? No, but all joking aside, he finds his power.
Right.
He finds his power at that moment, and he's able to compose music that is meaningful. He's able to express his identity in a meaningful way, and his life takes off, right? His career takes off. He ends up winning prize after prize. His music is performed all over the world by some of the top tier orchestras. And then in 1980, he wins a Pulitzer for a composition of his, which is called In Memory. Sorry, I blanked there for a second. In Memory of a Summer Day. And he is at the top of his game. You can look in a music history textbook, like I could find one around here, and turn to the later chapters, and you will find David del Tredici. He is in the history books. So this is no joke as far as his career trajectory, right? But remember, he's still living a kind of personal life in terms of his own identity. He's not broadcasting the fact that he's gay into the broader world. Not that it matters, right? Not that he should or shouldn't, but he's not doing that. That's just simply an observation. But then something interesting happens. So in the 1990s, well, first he has a period where he's so famous and his career is so significant that he becomes, again, in his own words, a fall down drunk, right? He becomes an alcoholic, and he justifies it, saying that he just couldn't handle being on this pedestal in the arts community, right? In the classical music world. And so to kind of take the edge off of that experience, he starts drinking and he falls into a 10-year period of being an alcoholic. And the way that he got out of it, again, I'm just using his words.
Right.
He says to himself, I cannot do this to my talent. The alcoholism was killing him like it would anyone, right? And he comes out of it. And so what's on the other side? When you have 10 years of this kind of addiction, what's on the other side? So he discovers what he calls his inner life. And that inner life is now taking what was a private expression of his identity and flipping it outward, flipping it into the larger world. And so how does he do it? Through music. So he starts writing music that is overtly gay themed, right? Now, you notice some of your viewers might be noticing that I'm not using the term queer, because I think, and I've spoken about this with because this film of mine, it's been premiered at various festivals. Some of them are like LGBTQ plus festivals, and I've had this conversation with the presenters at these festivals because just in full disclosure, I'm not gay, and I say that because it's an experience that is outside of me, right? I don't know on my skin what it's like to be a gay person in the world or a queer person in the world, or for that matter, to be a non-heteronormative person in the world, right? Mm-hmm. That's just my experience. I don't know a lot of things. I don't think that I judge those experiences. I just don't know them.
Right.
So I've had conversations with people who do know, and I'll ask them, so tell me, what is the difference between using the word gay and using the word queer? Right? Why should we distinguish that kind of question? And I've had really fascinating conversations about that, where again, the way I understand it is that the word queer is a larger term. It encompasses many more orientations, many more identities, and it's somewhat more fluid and flexible than the way that the term gay has been used traditionally. I'm not sure if that encompasses the nuances
Hmm.
of the terminology, but the reason I'm not using queer when it comes to describing David Del Tredici is because he would never use that term. He was of a different generation. His generation was still thinking in this kind of dichotomous model of gay and straight, or in some
Hmm.
cases, gay versus straight, right? Because it wasn't two identities that could coexist. It
Right.
was a kind of antagonistic relationship, and you can only imagine the kind of internal grief and psychological, just the tragedy of people who felt, again, I'm not saying this from personal experience, but the people who feel one way internally and cannot communicate that into an accepting environment, right? That is a tragedy, right? There are many tragedies in the world. That is one of them. That is, if anything, at the very least, a psychological tragedy, and probably more. So Del Tredici, David, he starts to, he gets out of his alcoholism and he starts to discover his inner self, which is this very open, very free, and very overt uh, connection with his own sexual identity. But it's not just about being gay for him, it
Hmm.
becomes also this kind of performative, and I don't mean that in any negative sense, but a kind of performance of some of the more extreme avenues, like S&M, right? S&M, the kind of master slave relationship, the leather and bondage and that kind of thing, if you're in
Hmm.
that world. So he starts to write music that reflects those themes. And some of his song cycles from that era, the 1990s and the early 2000s, are, for example, Gay Life, right? I mean, just imagine as a classical composer putting out a publication called Gay Life. I mean, that it's already problematic, right, in some areas of our society. And then he goes even further with a song cycle called My Favorite Penis Poems. I mean, and this is what I mean. You got to love the fact that he has no boundaries. My favorite penis poems. And you can say that word over and over again. And I've had conversations with David where he starts laughing. He's like, the word penis is not a bad word, but everyone gets just a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe when I watch this back, I'll see my shoulders come up when I say that. My favorite penis poems, like that. But in all truth, it's not a bad word because words don't have that kind of power unless it's by some sort of tacit consent that we as a society recognize that there's something troubling about them. And so in this film, the name of my film is Secret Music, and it chronicles this question of, can we really assign a sexual identity to music? Because what David did when I started making the film, right? Remember, I'm just going to take your listeners back about 40 minutes. I made that first film of mine about Donald Harris and his early Opus One. That's, by the way, why my channel is Opus One Films. And it took a year from start to finish. And like I said, I was spoiled with that process because it was so easy, relatively speaking.
Hmm.
I started making Secret Music, and it didn't take a year. It didn't take 2 years. It took 7 years to make. And it's not that filming was going on for 7 years. It was just filming, thinking, finding people to interview. The scope of the project was immense. And what made it so complicated was that early on in the process, during one of my first lengthy interviews, documented, filmed interviews with David Del Tredici. We're
Hmm.
talking about his childhood. We're talking about his flower arranging. He's 10 years old. The fact that he started playing the piano to get out of taking gym class, in the 1940s. And he suddenly, we're taking a break, and he says to me, Daniel, can you ask me about gay music?
Right.
So I'm like, what's gay music? And I know you've heard this because we spoke about this over the phone, but your viewers, your listeners haven't heard this, I don't think. And so it took him 5 years to come up with an answer. What is gay music? And I think the reason for that is actually very logical, because this was something that was just innate for him, right? His identity, who he is, who he was, who he will become, the way he expresses himself, all of these things are just embedded. And so when someone comes along and says, "Hey, Marquise, explain yourself," I would imagine that you would just say, "What do you mean? Like
Right.
from what perspective? Why?" And first of all, why do I even have to justify myself or explain myself for anyone? I'm happy being myself, and if you want to figure it out, just spend time with me. And I
Right.
think
Yes,
that that's what
exactly.
ended up happening. So David said, "I write gay music." I said, "What do you mean by gay music?" And then he said, "Well, I mean, he didn't say this, but then it took 5 years to get to an answer." And I'm gonna give away the answer because I think it's such an elegant and truthful answer. Um, but I want to remind your viewers why I'm here. Obviously, it's awesome to shoot the shit, right? And just talk about this stuff and to reconnect with you, of course. But also, the film has been shown, in various places. And just before the pandemic started, I it was going to be it was going to be shown, and I hope it still will be, at the National Gallery of Art in DC. It was supposed to be done last summer, but of course, all that got canceled, and hopefully that will happen again. But the Hunter Music, the Hunter College Music Department is going to be live streaming it on May 13th at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. And after the film is shown, David and I will have a Q&A. And so hopefully you can provide that link in your chat as well. You should have
Yes,
that.
I'm going.
So I want your viewers to come watch it. It's free. It's 80 minutes long. It might even change your mind about classical music, if you had some bias one way or the other. But I want to tell your viewers what David said because it's such a profound message, and truthfully, it has nothing to do with gay music exclusively. It has everything to do with the larger idea of being a marginalized or non-mainstream group. That's really what it's about. So let me tell you what it is. So I mentioned earlier this song cycle that David composed, My Favorite Penis Poems. And it's a series of several songs all about, well, penises, right? In one way or another. Some of the songs are straight, some of the songs are gay, some of the songs are just ruminations on sex. And the last song, like the culminating song, is it's called Please Master. And David uses poetry by Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet. I mentioned him before. Of that, it's that same generation with Jack Kerouac, on the road fame, James Dean, that era. So Allen Ginsberg, who was gay, he wrote this poem, Please Master, all about it. It is explicitly about the S&M relationship. I mean, explicitly, it leaves nothing to the imagination. So you could make the statement that this is not exactly socially acceptable material. All right, I'll start with that. So in the film, I had been looking for a couple of years for a performance. I'd been looking for a piece of music by David that I could perform in the film that would not leave anything to the imagination, that would be an explicit realization of, quote, gay music, right? So I find this piece, David directs me to it. He goes, "Well, why don't you take a look at Please Master?" So it's a piece for piano and two singers. And what David does is the poem itself is really just a kind of, it's from the perspective of in the S&M relationship, it's from the perspective of the receiver, right? Again, to use the terminology, it's the master and slave, right? So it's from the slave perspective, who's, your audience is okay with me, dropping F bombs, right? So it's the guy who's about
Trust
to,
me, if that there's oh god,
I
there's
just
a
I just
whole
want to just
there's a
want to
whole
be I just want to be sure it's from the perspective of the person who's about to get fucked. Okay, so and it's like it's a constant invitation for sexual acts of various degrees to be performed on him. Okay, so what David does is he divides up the part. Let's call it the supplicant,
Mm-hmm.
like in a religious sense. He divides up that part among two people, or between two people. So we're performing this a rehearsal at his house, at David's house, his apartment in the West Village, um, and this is all being filmed. And in between takes of the rehearsal of the music, we're also discussing gay music again. And this is where David finally, after again, like I said, after 5 years, he starts answering the question, what is gay music? So this is what he says. First, he deflects. He says, well, the real question is, why are there so many great gay composers in American 20th century music? Aaron Copland, Samuel Barber, Leonard Bernstein. I'm sorry, I'm not outing anyone, am I? No, I'm just kidding. These are public figures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he's asking this question again. It's quasi rhetorical. Why? Why are there so many great gay composers? You could flip the question a little bit as well. You could also say, why are some of these composers also not exactly, well, what do we say, the mainstream in terms of
Mm-hmm.
their ethnicity and religion? Like, for example, you take some great American composers who were Jewish as well, right? The reason I'm talking about this is just because, again, I'm drifting toward identities that are largely on the periphery of mainstream waspish American society, right? Your white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity, which kind of defines the mainstream society, right? I hope this makes sense, right? I'm
I
not
know it
saying.
does.
So, in other words, here we have people who are identifying, who are on the peripheries, but they're making significant contributions that become absorbed into the mainstream, kind of like jazz, that is, quintessentially an African American art, something that comes out of the slave songs of the 19th century, and that gets absorbed into the American mainstream. And now it's just American music, despite its very specific origins. So going back to David here,
Mm-hmm.
he's asking this question, which is very specific. Why are there great gay composers? Okay, that's his first deflection. But then finally, he kind of pivots back and he says, you know what this is? Imagine a pearl in an oyster.
Mm-hmm.
So initially, it's a piece of sand that gets into the oyster, and it's an irritant. And suddenly, it turns into this beautiful, precious thing. And that was such an amazing analogy because that's exactly what it is. So if you are a marginalized person and if you belong to a marginalized group on the periphery, you are a kind of irritant to mainstream society. Whatever the dominant group is, that dominant group, and again, to use some of David's language, the dominant group wants to hurt you. It wants to kill you. It wants to erase you. It wants to pretend that you're not even there. And this has happened to not just gay people, it's happened to a lot of people who are, again, on that periphery. But if we really think about the relationship between the dominant group and the periphery, it's not so easy, right? The dominant group wouldn't really exist without the periphery. So it's something I mentioned to you yesterday that, we exist on the backs and on the blood of the exploited classes, right? The people who have been beaten are the people who have created the society in many ways, right?
Right.
It's
Yes.
not,
In
it's
many
not that
ways.
simple. It's not that simple. Obviously, this is a nuanced conversation to have, but it would be wrong to say that that again, the marginalized groups in their various forms, whoever they may be, because there's so many, right? It can be women, it can be people of different ethnicities and different races, different religions. There's just so many. So in this particular film, I'm not trying to capture a statement about every marginalized group. We're talking specifically about gay people in the music industry. And to be even more specific, because anyone listening might say, wait a second, there's so much sexual innuendo at the very least in pop music. Like, let's just, again, here's an easy example. Let's just take disco, right? I mean, obviously, the whole Studio 54 culture is all about that, right? It's all about sex. It's all about sex in various forms. But that may be true in popular music, but it's not obvious or overt in classical music. It has been part of the sort of not to be on the nose about this, but it's been part of the secret conversation in terms of classical music.
You
So
know, I'm
when I
sorry to interrupt you, and when I watch this back, I'm probably gonna be like, you should have just let him continue. But you do the thing I do, which is funny. You do the sometimes I'll mention as a part of a sentence the name of the channel, paradigm shift, and I'll be like trying to shift your and like I do the same thing. It's like sometimes you'll just land there. It's part
well,
of the
yeah,
thing.
no, but I mean this. Yeah, yeah, I get it, I get it. But in this case, it really is kind of like it's a known secret, right? So when I mentioned that composer Franz Schubert, who you could make a comparison with David del Tredici or Robert Schumann, another again European 19th century composer,
Studied that hard. I was there.
well, or Felix Mendelssohn, or again, your listeners will also kind of start, if they're really listening carefully to what I'm saying, they might also say, it's funny how this guy is constantly naming men and only men. Where are the women in this? Where are the people of color in this?
Part of
All
the problem, part of the discussion.
it's I'm not excluding. What I am saying though is that again, we go back to the question of the dominant narrative, right? History is not one thing. I was thinking about this earlier today. History is really histories, right? It should be in plural. I'm talking about one type of history. And really, I'm not trying to do it to the exclusion of others. I'm just saying that if we want to talk meaningfully about David del Tredici, we have to compare him to Schubert or Schumann or Mendelssohn or Wagner or Mahler. And yes, is it a list of dead white guys? Yeah, yeah. Does that mean that this is good or bad? No, it's neutral. It just means that this is the most helpful way of talking about him. And if we want to veer off into a broader conversation, we should. But the most important thing now is simply to say this is the reality of our culture, that we sometimes start talking about things as though it's the only narrative, but it isn't. That's the point, right? So that's the recognition that we have to have, is it's just not the only narrative. It's one narrative among many. So but just to get back to this point with Schubert, I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of kind of circumstantial evidence that he was gay, even though he was in an early 19th century Austrian society. He lived and worked in Vienna. That wasn't exactly forthcoming with that title the same way we think about it today. Of course, it would be bizarre to apply modern sensibilities to the historical record, right? That's just weird when you do that, right?
Right.
Because you're missing the point, right? Why did those societies exist as they did? If we keep comparing them to our own sensibilities, then we're losing something in the translation. That's all. I'm not, again, I don't want to come off sounding like an idiot, so I'm going to table that particular issue. But so with David del Tredici, this is what he says. The grain of sand is an irritant. It creates the pearl in the oyster. It's something beautiful that emerges out of the difficulties of being that dissonance, right? To use that musical term. And so this is David's larger point, and I'll kind of wrap up with this because I'm sure you have other things you want to talk about. But this is David's conclusion. What is gay music? Well, gay music is not that you play some chord like I had done earlier, whether it's major or minor or what have you, and you kind of like tongue in cheek say, well, this is a straight chord and this is a queer chord. I mean, bullshit. Of course not.
Right.
Of course not. But what you do is as you ask the question, where does this music come from, and how and what journey did it take from its inception to its recognition in its world, or in the world of music. So David is saying that for him, as someone from the peripheries, as remember, a person coming out in the 1960s and 70s, and then recognizing himself as a mature and openly gay person in the 1990s going forward. Remember, these are the people who dealt with the AIDS crisis firsthand, right? The AIDS quilt, the horrendous tragedy of the initial, the first generation of people who dealt with their friends and relatives and loved ones dying from AIDS, when the government didn't even recognize this as a serious issue, when people kept saying, no, only gay men have AIDS, right? This is that period of time when it was scary, right? I mean, can we really imagine? Maybe we can have something, we get just like a toe in the door. If you think about trying to date during coronavirus, you're like, I don't know, have you been tested?
Right.
Have you had your vaccinations? I'm not trying to make light of it. I'm just saying that like this is the first time that maybe a whole generation of people are thinking, well, I should kind of be careful with who I meet up with, right? But imagine that it's a question of life and death, and on top of that, an entire society to just
Chastising a specific group
right,
of people
right.
as if the society
Oh,
itself isn't that reflection of that.
right, as if they don't exist. And this is why David kept saying that it's, you're growing up and society wants to, for lack of a better term, they want to just kill you off. You don't exist. So now you're trying to express yourself as a musician. How do you do it? You work 1,000 times harder than the people who are already in the mainstream, and you eventually break through. Of course, not all, but the reason that David broke through, well, I don't know, his talent, the fact that he didn't care for boundaries, the fact that he was willing to burn bridges. I mentioned earlier that he left Harvard. I'm not saying that that is the example, but it's the attitude, it's the ability to walk away from things when there's a voice inside of you that tells you, are you really sure you want to do this? While at the same time, you have an inner voice, right? To use what David keeps referencing himself, this instinctive voice that says, I have to do it this way. And, you know, screw the consequences. I know this might not turn out for the better for me, but I have to do it. And David talks about that a lot in terms of his own compositional style. He says things like, because I've asked him, forget about the sort of socio-political discussion about gay music. I've just asked him more perfunctory questions like, what's your process of composition? And he's joked around with me. He says things like, oh, I have to jerk off. I'm like, so that was, he's like, yeah, once or twice a day, and then I'm refreshed. He says this in the film. If you guys watch it, you will see him talk about that. He'll say, I have to go to an orgy. This is what I mean. Talking to him is refreshing, to say the least. I once asked him years ago about a guy he was dating. I'm like, oh, how'd you guys meet? And he's like, do you really want to know? And I'm like, yeah, why not? He goes, it was a New Year's orgy. I'm like, all right. I mean,
Yeah, a lot of people would hear that and be, whoa, but it's like
look,
that is a matter of fact in
David
that
has
it's an event. And to it's that's funny. Wow, it's the social construct of what we consider taboo, even though we even have categories and definitions. And if we want to even get even deeper into it, the idea of the entire pornography industry in itself glorifies that, but does it in a way where
well
men's egos
for
don't get checked at the door for, oh, we have different names for, yeah, no, there's a lot that can be.
it glorifies that for the heteronormative structure, right? But only more recently, of course, for the again what traditionally have been the peripheral groups. Absolutely. But listen, David lives this life, and the thing is, why do we have to? This is kind of a stupidly rhetorical question, but why do we have to shy away from it? And the answer is we don't. We just don't. And David, once he started to ask these questions and live his life out loud, so to speak, he has never looked back. And I know that sounds kind of corny and cliche, but he just is. He just is who he is. And that's kind of the beautiful thing about him, because there are so many of us, myself included, we live this life of constantly checking whether we are appropriate, right? Whether we are really doing what's right given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And this goes back to one of the very first things that you and I started talking about today, which is what does it really mean to be subversive? What does it really mean to be a rebel? Because if you really are that person, you have to accept the consequences, even if they are dramatically unpleasant. Because if you don't, you're not that. You can pretend to be subversive and you can claim that, but look, I pierced my ear 4 ways and only this side and not that side. Therefore, I'm subversive, right? Well, that's awesome. That's a fashion statement. That's a choice you're making about your body, but that doesn't necessarily translate to subversion. So again, that was just an example.
Right. No, I
Don't
feel
jump on me.
like
You know,
I feel like I've even said that before when like considering your or I was doing voice reel for a thing that I've been dying to do ever since I was like 8 years old. And it's like, okay, no, matter of fact, we could go even deeper with it. Take me, for example. It's like, hey, I have, I'm blessed to have a little bit of money. The pandemic didn't, or out of the pandemic, I was struggling for a little bit, but I have a comfortable. If an accident or an emergency came up, I'd be okay with it. But the idea of like, okay, I'm quitting everything, I'm going directly to Twitch, and I'm not making a cent from anything else. I don't care about anything else. Like, okay, that's great, but like, if you start running out of money, you do have the opportunity of like applying to go back to teach at a school, or as we spoke before, oh, could you college speaking? That there are avenues to completely go away from all of that and say, well, I'm moving to New Mexico and I'm starting a village, and I'm going to make sure that this village is self-sustaining to prove to the rest of the country there is a different way that we can look at the map out of how we build societies or cities or rural areas, and there's ways that we can be more of a commune and help each other, which would then take the added pressure of okay, childcare and wanting to actually live, like giving the opportunities to a community that doesn't normally have them. That would be subversive, giving up everything for the sake of the identity that you wish to, or that you truly believe exists within you, as opposed to, oh, I'm just going to do this for a few months, and if it doesn't work out, oh well.
Well,
Like,
so to that point, right, about how does it work out at the end? So I had asked the question, why did David become successful? So one of the answers is maybe not so much why he became successful, but rather we can ask the question to begin with, because he's the guy who got through that meat grinder of dispossession, of being on the outskirts of fighting his way in, and he rose out of that immensely difficult, and you might even say dangerous process, right? Danger in terms of, would he be able to keep his job? Would he be able to keep a semblance of some normality in his life or normalcy in his life? So he came out the other end, and we very comfortably, like me, I get as a documentarian, I get to kind of walk into his apartment and say, all right, let's talk about your life. Now that you've gone through all of these challenges and you've made it out the other end, let's reflect, right? So I get that it's such a privileged position that I feel very fortunate to be able to do that, to ask him. But imagine, but remember that for every one person like David Del Tredici who survives that process and makes it out the other side, there are more people who didn't, right? There are all of the fallen who tried and got just destroyed by the machine of the mainstream, right? That just spat them out, and that's it. And in the historical record, how many of those people have just vanished, right? How many of those people did survive, but as footnotes in history? So it's something to remember as well, that David represents a certain identity of a person who was able to make it through. But for every David, there are a million, you know, anonymous.
right, yes, definitely.
So that's another important thing to bring up, and what I hope the film will ultimately communicate. Because of course, the things we're talking about now, there's no room in this film to go into such a discussion. I mean, you and I have been talking for longer than the film actually goes by. The running time is 80 minutes. You and I have been talking for
We've
almost an hour and
you
a half.
we've oh, depends on where my clock is on things. We've hit the 120 mark, so we're about there.
No, but what I just mean is not so much the exact time, but just that, we've been talking about
Oh,
these things for
yeah.
longer than the film, which means, of course, the film doesn't go into all of these nuances. It just can't. But the discussions around the film are what matter. So what I would hope is for anyone watching this and actually becoming intrigued by some of these socio um, ideological questions is to watch the film and see, and to judge honestly whether I've made a film with my team, because it's not just me. I have such a talented team of people without whom there is no film. Otherwise, it would just be me standing on the street talking about gay music, and who wants to listen to that? So there's a team of people. We have, as a group, created this film. I just happen to be the face of it, right? So because no one else wants to talk about that. No, I happen to be the face of it. But the point is, watch the film and you guys tell me, reach out to me. You can do it through, again, on YouTube, on Facebook, whatever, IG, secret music film, and tell me if I have actually been able to accomplish this, what I've set out to do, which is very simple. Have we explained or posed the right questions and some degree of answers that that capture the complexity of this question of anyone with an identity projected into the creative space? So in this particular case, David Del Tredici projecting his sexual orientation and identity, because it's not one thing, right? It's a complicated thing, into the creative space, which for him is music. So does that path make sense? And how does it in turn influence today's generation of creative people, of artists, of musicians? Maybe this is becoming a somewhat anachronistic conversation. Maybe there are some people listening to this who are just saying, God, there's a lot of this going on about something that people don't seem to care about as much anymore. But the truth is, maybe the conversation of gay or straight is becoming a little bit old fashioned, but we have other things that are just as contentious now, like the trans community, or the topic of queerness, or issues related to ethnicity, religion, race, you name it. Right?
I know that you are a little bit disconnected from that era of conversation right now. Basic, and I'm not even going to say because of who you are. I mean, you're busy, literally busy. Like, you've been doing something for a long period of time. I would expect that your mind would be focused on that. But it's very funny that you say that, because we have an artist now by the name of Lil Nas X, which I'm sure you've heard of, and that's a huge, like, battle between tradition and what is accepted in society. And it generally feels like, and I'm sure you've seen me talk about this before, the idea of the left being the one who's super open and wants everybody to, explore whatever, and the right is rigid in religion and tradition and Christianity. And so, no, these are topics that are super prevalent. I feel like when I hear you talk about it, it's grounded in more, okay, this is tangible, I'm going out and actually speaking to these people, as opposed to what the conversation is around, like, my age and such. It's the internet and everybody sharing their opinions, and nobody's really having a conversation to get down to the ground of, well, why do we feel this way? It's, okay, we're here, which side are you picking? And I appreciate.
Well, you'd be surprised, because when you said that I'm a little bit disconnected, I understand what you mean. Because again, from like the identity politics perspective, you can fall into that fallacy of looking at me and making assumptions about what I would know. But look, I have friends and family members who would fall into that camp of people who you wouldn't expect me to know, if you want to judge based on. I'm not saying you are, by
Right,
the
no,
way,
yeah, no.
but if one, the generic one, wants to judge me because I happen to be a straight white male, which I am, so does that mean that I immediately am disqualified from having an understanding of things that are not what it is that I
It
seem
is
to
I'm
represent?
sorry to cut you off again. It is just so funny, because that is a major conversation between a very high level political streamer, and that conversation came up, and I'd like to, for the sake of it, I'm going to say you are correct in that. We're agreeing there that there is that. But it's funny you mention that, because he took offense to the idea that, oh, because you happen to be a straight white male, you will see things, or you are allowed to see things through a lens that might make you feel disconnected from it. And that's obviously, as an observation, I would say.
I think that's true. I
Right,
think that
yeah. He took offense to the idea that that would be true, but it's like that would be the observation. Now,
I don't think
you going into it a little deeper, obviously, and I shouldn't say you going into it a little deeper, you taking time out of your life, or actually living the example of, I don't view things that way because, I'm me, right? Like we talked about earlier, owning
but,
the identity of
but
who you
I'll
are.
also say this. I don't mean to interrupt you,
Yo,
but
go
I'll
ahead.
say this, and I think this is very simple. I made the joke to you on the phone that wisdom is knowing when to be quiet. Well, look, I'm not going to pretend that I'm wise, but I will say very clearly and emphatically, people need to know when to be quiet. And instead of running their mouths about things that they don't really know, and the more they talk, the worse it gets. So, honestly, my observations about identity politics, my observations about the relationships among, let's say, people of various ethnicities, religions, identities, especially ones that I'm not a part of, the best course of action I can take is to first be quiet and just listen. And I can agree or disagree, that's fine. But I have to understand first before I can say anything. And I'm lucky in the sense that as a teacher, as a, as a professional teacher, as a professor, I get to do that. I get to be quiet and let my students speak, because every generation knows something about its experience that other generations cannot. Maybe the other generations don't like that. Maybe they're angry about that. Maybe they don't take younger generations seriously. But look, the bottom line is time so far only moves forward, right? I mean, not to make this existential. So at some point, there will be no older generation. It will disappear. It's just inevitable. So the younger generation will then move into the position of the older generation, and then there'll be the next you get it. I don't have to belabor it.
Right.
This is an obvious point. So at some point, every older generation has to accept that their influence will eventually subside and wane. And I feel like I'm not exactly the older generation yet, but I'm also not the younger generation because I'm in my 40s. So I'm in a sort of interim. I'm in the in between. And I really have to kind of be careful with how I express myself in this. That's why, if for anyone who's been like listening carefully to,
Oh, chat's been you have a few people in here who have like really been connecting with you saying, and they really thank you for being here.
well, thank you, and thank you to them. I'm just being careful with my words because language is powerful, and if I start mouthing off in the way that it's so easy for someone in my position to do, right? Someone who kind of, you can make all sorts of assumptions, like I said, and you can say, well, I have a certain degree of privilege because of what I am. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. It doesn't necessarily have to mean anything beyond that, but I just have to be careful with my words. And that's really all I can say. The important thing is to listen. And this is exactly what, going back to that film with David Del Tredici, I really had to do that. And believe me, there's so many times where I wanted to just say, I don't even understand what you're talking about. But that would have been terribly wrong. And that would have also negated what I had said earlier, that I'd like to think of myself as a non judgmental person. But of course, that can't be true. Nobody is completely non judgmental because then we're not humans. We all have personalities and we all have a sense of what rubs us the wrong way, and what we agree with. And so it's impossible to be 100% neutral. But in my case, what I tried to do, with plenty of failure, I'm sure, but what I try to do is just listen to someone and who speaks about his or her own or their personal experience, and just say, okay, this is very different from anything I could possibly understand, but who's to say that that is not, no, I have to say this differently, that is just as legitimate as any other experience. That's it. And that's it. And that's where it ends, right? So I don't know. What do you think about that?
No,
I
I think that's the best way to go about it. I just there's no, and I hate that because it's usually like, I want to find a piece that you said something. And I want to no. I think you're very astute at being one of the, if we want to say few people who understand both sides of that realm of, there are things that I don't understand, so there's no point in me trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong. It's better for me to just absorb it and then say, well, I would disagree with that, but that person isn't a bad person because of what they said. So even if I disagree with it, that's their lifestyle. That's how they choose. And there's no, it doesn't change me. It doesn't make me go outside and say, why do you people do this type? Or why does this? And look, there's none of that follow up that brings any, which I think I said to you going all the way back, about the major chord. Like there's no hidden You resolve where you should resolve, as opposed to being introduced to new elements and saying, well, I won't play that. Like, I that's you're not the church hearing the tritone for the first time and saying, that's ugly, that's against our tradition.
Devil in music, yeah. Well, I mean, don't congratulate me too much yet. It's a work in progress, and that's really all I think that we can hope to that we can aspire to. We just have to try. Um, and the other thing, of course, is what's wrong with being accepting when I think part of the problem is when we feel that if someone else's opinion is legitimate, we start to think, well, maybe we have to question our own framework. And
Hmm.
I think that's where a lot of people are, where people vehemently disagree. It may be in part because they're afraid that this will require them, when they realize the other truths out there, to change their own perspectives and frameworks. And that can be very disturbing. That can be dangerous, because what if it turns out I learned something from you, and it turns out that something that I held so dear to my own self identity, that turns out that now I have to dismantle it and I lose myself in the process. I mean, there is a danger to that, of course, if you allow that to happen. The flip side of that is simply to say, doesn't I don't have to deconstruct myself. I can add to myself, right? But that's what life is. It's both processes. You deconstruct yourself at some point, and you augment yourself at other points. Not to use the augmented triad analogy, but we have to do that if we want to grow, right? Growth comes from pain. Growth comes from tension. In like the most sophomoric sense, why do you work out?
I
You
oh, I was gonna say that.
Why do
Yeah.
you weightlift? Why do you weightlift? To tear some muscle fibers and have what is it, hypertrophy, right? So that you grow. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. Why do you have a kick-ass cardio workout? And by the way, working out for me is actually something really important. It's a major part of my life. It's become so for the last almost 8 years, because I went through something. I'm not going to, I don't have to divulge this because I don't think your listeners care, but because we all have something, right? But I'll say this: I went through something really traumatic in my life, um, relative to my experience. And it was something that can never really be resolved ever in my life, but I can take steps to make it a little bit more manageable. And what helped me is working out, right? Just the tension that, like I said when we started, I can talk for hours, as your listeners are now becoming keenly aware. I can talk without any cadence, without end, and that doesn't rub everyone the right way. But the point is, I'm very self-aware about this, so I knew that the only way that I can start making progress in my personal life, my psychological life, based on this trauma, is to do something that doesn't involve talking. Like, for me, just to shut up for a certain period of time. And exercise is it. I chose not to go to therapy, even though that's perfectly legitimate. I'm not saying anything.
Right.
But therapy is talking as well, right? In part. And I was like, I can't talk about this. I need to do something else. And the something else turned into really hardcore workouts that would just get me to stop thinking and just experience my body, so to speak, the pain I was going through. And that has become a kind of high for me that is really important to my routine. Um, and I think it's also made me more humble, if anything, because you just realize that, life is pain. Again, I'm not trying to, this is not morbid. I really don't mean this in a morbid way. We experience pain in order to appreciate pleasure. If everything is pleasurable, nothing is pleasurable. If everything is painful, nothing is pain. Well, no, that's probably not true.
But
Pain,
I
pain,
but yeah, we
pain
could,
is pain.
yeah, yeah.
Pain is pain, but pleasure is something apart. So, kind of like, if we want to wrap this back into the whole tonal atonal dichotomy, or let's say the people on the margins of society versus the dominant group, then it's a yin yang relationship, right? So pain is not pain without pleasure. Pleasure is not pleasure without pain. Um, the periphery doesn't exist without the mainstream, and the mainstream certainly doesn't exist without the periphery. So that's the kind of conversation we're having. And if you want to even put I'm sorry, I'm really sorry to do this, but if you want to put this back on the Matrix, because just because I mentioned just because I mentioned it, the human beings inside the Matrix wouldn't exist without the machines, and the machines wouldn't exist without those human beings, right? It's such a simplistic thing, and I really don't need to belabor this because it just becomes really reductive after a while, and kind of just like, we're treading water. But it's just that things exist in this continual relationship, a cyclic relationship, and we have to recognize that as well. So for anyone who throws up their hands and says, "I don't want to hear this other opinion," you should, because it's a cycle, right? That other opinion will actually bolster your own viewpoints, and it's healthy and it's needed. And you have to be in some degree of psychic pain when you disagree with someone, and when someone says something that sounds bizarre to you, because there's no way to grow without that. If you're in your own bubble, and the internet encourages that, everyone knows this. If I wanted to hear an echo chamber of my own thoughts, I can do it.
You
You
can
can do it.
manufacture that, yes.
Absolutely. So we have to avoid that if we want to grow as responsible, mature. And again, I'm so sorry to fall back on this cliche, sorry, not sorry kind of a thing. But, people say citizens of the world, with all of the sort of bullshit associated with that term, the truth of it is you want to be a citizen of the world. You want to be a person in the world. That is important. You have to engage with the things that you don't know, with the things with which you disagree. And that's another thing that this film, hearing someone say, "I write gay music," and the first question is, what is gay music? At least I asked, right? I took the first correct step, which is, what is gay music, as opposed to going, okay,
Right.
kind of like on SNL with Pete Davidson character of Chad. All right, all right. At least I didn't do that. At least I didn't do that. At least I actually asked. And I think if I have anything to be proud of, it's that first step, is just to listen to someone say something and then go, "What do you mean?" No judgment. What do you mean? Tell me what you mean. And if we can live in that shared experience, we'll be better off for it.
I
As
absolutely
kumbaya
agree.
as that sounds.
as as dreamful and as hopeful as I will always say, I believe that that is the point of kind of this channel, this existence. It is always to make sure that we are not thinking in binaries. Every situation, every thought, even as we approach, let's say, the eviler of thoughts, it has to come from somewhere. Something had to have been either taken away or left away in somebody's life for them to want to land in that place. And if we don't understand, which I hate the idea of, history, we got to learn it so we don't repeat it, because doesn't help. It just does. For in some countries, it just doesn't help. You still have to know, okay, these were the signs, these were the things that fostered a community of people who thought this way. If we all say this is not a thought that we think, if we all come to a mutual agreement, this is not where we want to be in humanity's history again. We don't want to enter that. How do we create an environment where that thought doesn't foster?
Education. It starts with what you said. You became a teacher for a reason. I became a teacher for a reason. For me, it was because I have this, it just bubbles up inside of me. I have to communicate, right? I have to get it out somehow. So for the same reason that I'm a performer on stage, for the same reason I started making documentary films, because it's all related to that germinal need to express oneself. For me, I have to express myself somehow. And ironically enough, in my personal life, I'm not this outgoing person. I'm kind of restrained and reserved. And, Marquise, maybe you can speak to this if you want to. But when you first met me, of course, it was under a kind of formal circumstance where you were a student and I was a teacher. And of course, we're kind of acting our parts there as well, right? That may not be a true representation of what we are, but I would imagine that you probably thought I was a very reserved person.
Yes.
And I think that's fine, actually, because, David Del Tretici and I were having lunch a couple years ago, same composer, right? And he said to me, I think the people who are reserved when you first meet them are actually much more respectful of the people they're interacting with than people who are over the top, outgoing, and open. Because those boundaries that we set in our interpersonal relationships, especially at the very beginning, it's to me, it's easier to go from a place of distance to a place of intimacy than it is to begin intimately. And then where do you go from there? If someone you meet and within 5 minutes they're telling you their life story, you're just like, what? What the fuck is happening here? Like,
Yeah.
did I invite this into my life? So this is what I mean. The reason I'm reserved, it's not some sort of calculated position, but I've always felt that I should not be imposing myself on other people. We should start with this sort of neutral space where people gradually invite you to talk with them about certain things, and then gradually you open up. I think that, when we started, I said I was nervous because of that reason, because I know you, but your viewers, your listeners, first of all, I don't see them. I don't know who's in the chat. I'm not concerned about this.
Right
I
now.
have no idea who's listening to this. So in a way, part of my nerves are that I don't know how naturally I'll be able to transition from the place where people look at some dude on the screen, here I am, and to the place where I'm actually communicating in a way that's meaningful and has where people have invited me in, so to speak, whether it's quietly, passively, or actively. That's what I'm nervous about. So in terms of you mentioned, yeah, but you've performed for thousands of people. Yeah, I have, but there's a difference. If I'm on stage and I look out at my audience and I can hear them and I can hear the rustling in their seats, I have a sense of the room. I know whether they are welcoming me or not. But in this anonymous space, where you could tell me that there are 1 million people listening or 3 people listening, and it wouldn't really make any difference. I don't know. So that's where I'm a little bit nervous, because I just have to, I'm not sure if I've played the room right. So it's up to you to tell me if there are any reactions to this. If my messaging here, I'll use ad lingo. If my messaging is on point.
No, I think you've landed it. I do want to start to wrap it up because I did
Absolutely.
have a planned time and we've gone far over that. But I did, for the sake of it, I'm gonna say, like, I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
You
Oh,
already said something that makes me want to go on to like a thing about, like you were saying, getting used to, like, oh, I'm in this new space and I don't know if that's been, and I've expressed this to my chat, my audience. I've done it on YouTube, whatever. Like, I also have that fear, that innate fear of, like, I know I'm good at what I'm saying. I know that I'm entertaining. But is that landing with the right people at the right time? Am I saying something that's going too far? Are people having the negative opinion of it because they don't know my background? They don't know where. And do I have to explain that? Is that something that fear sheds off once you start to, and you just mentioned it, when you start to realize it's one way or another, they're engaging, they're here, like that's just gonna be it. If they
right.
choose to fall into the right side, the wayside, or they decide to stay, that's not a reflection of me. I am here to express myself. I am here to say my piece, and however that lands on you, that's
Mm.
how that lands on you, and that's just the way it has to be. You mentioned the performing thing, and I think I've said this on stream. I don't think I've told you, but like, I perform poetry, and once I start, I play a song in the beginning to set the mood while I'm not even on stage. I come in and I'm just in. I'm there. Like, the whole room, every room I've ever performed in except one. There's always going to be the one. Everybody's turned to me. You could hear a pin drop. Nobody's talking. Everybody's paying attention. And in my head, I'll be like, "That's not good enough. I need you invested. I need you in the story." And after the performances, I'll always get that. I've never seen anything like that. I've never been so involved in a performance before. And it's like, that's great. As long, and I'll always say this, and I say this to everybody I ever meet whenever I perform. I'm glad you enjoyed the performance. What did you get out of it? Where are you at? And that's the last line I always say in every performance that I have. It doesn't matter if you like this or you dislike this. I just don't want you to be the same person leaving the room as when you walked in the room. Because as long as there's a change, as long as you thought about something that made you either grow or challenge a belief that you had, then I did my job. And I think you did that as well here. And I think that this film that you are, because I've seen a film of yours before, and I was also taught by you. I think that you will
No,
have a
move on.
great. I think I think you'll have a great overview of this topic, this person, and you will feel the attention that you gave it. I think that I can expect a great message to be delivered to you, delivered by you from this film.
Marquise, thank you. Remember, you know, post the link to the YouTube stream May 13th at 7 p.m. I hope that I'm addressing your audience. I hope that you guys will join. It would mean so much to me because I think it's a topic that needs to be expressed and shown. And the nice thing is, you don't have to just listen to me because this composer will be on hand for a Q&A afterwards, and he's in his 80s, and he's got the wisdom of his age and his experience. And if you want to see what it's like to be a lifelong subversive person who probably wouldn't even acknowledge that that's what he is, which I think makes it more authentic, makes it more genuine. You can talk to him, you can ask him questions, and you know, he's at that point in his life where he's honest. Um, what I mean is, he doesn't. The masks that I'm sorry that I sound like I'm hesitating. The
It's okay.
masks that we wear in our existence, which we all do. There's nothing wrong with that. We have to do it. But the masks that we wear, eventually we make a choice. Do we keep them on, or do we finally take them off and expose our true selves? And this is what David Del Tredici has finally done. He was still, honestly, when the filming started, and you will be able to see this in the film, where he's wearing his leather vest and his hair is still dyed. It's dyed a kind of like brown red. And then in other scenes in the film, he's wearing just this sort of like red silk shirt. His hair is naturally gray, and he's more vulnerable. And that is kind of like the outward manifestation of where the mask has finally come off. And he's not talking in these kind of canned, prepared sentences the way that any famous person does. You know, when you spend several decades answering the same questions over and over again, your responses become canned and memorized inadvertently, right? It just happens. So when he stops doing that, and you can see that he's struggling for his words, he's trying to choose his words. You see the machinery, the thinking in the moment. You realize that this is the true vulnerable self revealed. And hopefully in the Q&A, well, first of all, it's in the film, but in the Q&A, you'll also experience that side of him. And that's all I would ever shoot for. If I'm making if I'm making a documentary about someone, I want that to be the end result, is for all those masks to come off. Because of that, Marquise, is exactly what you said about your own performances. That's when you draw the audience in, because we all can identify with the vulnerable self, but eventually we get put off with the veneer of perfection because it's superficial. It's nothing at the end of the day.
I like that. I like that a lot. I like that as a that's there it is. There's the key takeaway, guys. There's the key takeaway.
Thank you. I'll be here always. That's
um,
okay.
I'd like to thank you for being here. I'd like to thank you for spending time with me, if that's how we're gonna put it. Uh,
Aw. Wait, did you ever even say my name? You never even said my name, did you?
yes, I
Dear,
did. You
let's.
just weren't here for it.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Would you
I
like me
said
to say it again? Would you like to
my
introduce
name.
yourself?
Wait a second. This is like, would you like me to introduce it? That's from George Michael. I heard that recently.
Wow. Yes. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Anyway, Daniel Beliavsky, for anyone trying to figure out how to pronounce my last name. Hasn't been an issue in New York, though. But where I'm from Wisconsin, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Half the people couldn't pronounce the last
Felt that.
Daniel Beliavsky. Got a shameless self promotion eventually, right?
Is
It's
there anything else you would like to share with us? Any other things
Oh,
we should be looking out for?
you posted the links. What can I say? You know what I would really appreciate? I've got that YouTube channel. It's so new. It has a bunch of videos and piano lessons and music theory in interviews, some of my documentary stuff. YouTube.com, opus/opus one films. The one is a number. You posted it, I hope. You know what? Come and subscribe, please, so I can continue sharing through my channel the same way that Marquise, you've given me this awesome platform to be able to speak to you and to your audience here, which I'm so grateful for. So come and subscribe. It would help me out. I know that this is like the spiel. Everyone says this, like and subscribe. It would really help me out just for the YouTube algorithm. Yeah, that's the world we live in. So I would appreciate that tremendously. So thank you. Thank you to your audience. Thank you to you.
And thank you as well. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Um, get some get some rest. Apparently, it's time for me to go as well.
Right.
Get some rest, and I will hopefully hear from you in the future, and I will be there for your film.
Thank you very much. All right. Take care.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, guys. That was sick. That was sick.